This is Edward Siegel. Welcome to the Crisis Ahead podcast. Each week, we look at how companies, organizations, and individuals in the news are responding to, managing, or recovering from a crisis, and what you can learn from their successes or failures. My observations and recommendations are based on my experience managing crisis situations and advising others on how to respond to and bounce back from disasters, scandals, and other emergencies. My guest this week is Matt Tidwell, Assistant Dean of Graduate and Professional Studies at the University of Kansas. He's done research into Volkswagen's dieselgate scandal that was back in the news recently. Before Matt joins me, however, let's take a look at two other car-related crisis situations. Sometimes automobile companies send the wrong messages in their ads. Messages they may not even know were sent until the ads attract the wrong kind of attention. That was certainly the case recently when Audi withdrew and apologized for an ad that showed a child eating a banana while standing dangerously close in front of one of their cars. As reported by CNN, one person on social media observed that the image showed how easily a child could be killed by the car's driver. In a statement, Audi said they sincerely apologized for what they called an insensitive image, promised that the picture would not be used again, and that they would investigate how the campaign had been created. In May, Volkswagen pulled and apologized for a racist ad that it had posted on Instagram. According to the Washington Post, a company official said that the ad was, quote, an insult to every decent person, unquote. The video showed an outsized white hand pushing a black man away from a parked Golf 8 before flicking him into a restaurant. Volkswagen officials said they were horrified by the ad and blamed a, quote, lack of sensitivity and procedural errors, unquote, for its failure to prevent the creation and posting of the racist video. One way for business executives to help avoid a crisis is to always know what their company is doing or is planning on doing. Company officials should not be the last to know or be surprised or embarrassed when they find out what their company did or said. I've written a new book that provides important and detailed advice on how you can prevent, manage, and recover from more than 100 different kinds of crisis situations. Crisis Ahead: 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies. Crisis Ahead is now available as a paperback book wherever books are sold, and as an ebook from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Crisis Ahead is filled with case studies about how companies and public officials have prepared for and handled crisis situations, and the important lessons you can learn from their successes and failures. The book also includes checklists and exercises to help you get ready for and react to a crisis. You can learn more about the book at publicrelations.com. It's not too early to start preparing for the next crisis. That's because history shows there is always a next crisis, and the sooner you are ready for it, the better. Volkswagen made international headlines a few years ago when it was discovered the company was cheating on emissions tests. That scandal was in the news again recently when it was reported VW had paid out billions of dollars in compensation to drivers of cars whose emissions equipment or software had been rigged. Because of the issues involved in Dieselgate, I think this is a good time to take a look back at the crisis and the important lessons that can be learned from it. I'm happy to have as my guest today Matt Tidwell, who has done research into the scandal. He's written a case study about the crisis that will appear in a public relations textbook later this year. Public Relations, International Perspective, 3rd edition, from Sage Publications. Matt has led communications departments, written crisis communications plans, and helped manage high-profile crisis situations. He is now Assistant Dean for Graduate and Professional Studies at the University of Kansas. In 2018, he received the Arthur E. Lowell Communicator of the Year Award from the Kansas City chapter of the International Association of Business Communicators. It is the organization's highest honor. Thanks for being with me this week, Matt.
Ed, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure.
VW had been a highly ranked and regarded brand before Dieselgate. Tell us about your research into what happened to the company.
Well, thanks, Ed. Yeah, absolutely. I spent a lot of time on the Volkswagen case study. When you go for this thing called the PhD, research comes along with it. And in my case, I chose a case study research project, and happened to the time coincided well with the Volkswagen scandal, often known now as dieselgate. Really, my fascination started with, has always been with big brands and how they're perceived and how their reputation changes in the wake of a crisis. I just think that's a fascinating thing. Obviously, big corporations are highly visible under the microscope, lots of scrutiny, and certainly Volkswagen, which by many accounts was one of the most coveted auto brands really in history. In the case of Dieselgate, became a very interesting sort of case study. You mentioned their highly regarded reputation. Volkswagen, remember at the time, in the sort of the 2013-14 timeframe before this scandal hit, was, I believe, the second highest auto brand by reputation and by brand investment or reputation rankings in the world. And so truly a highly coveted brand. But of course, all that came crashing down when it was discovered that they had really had a systematic process for cheating emissions tests. So obviously, when you sell vehicles, they have to pass emission tests in various countries, the United States and throughout the world. Volkswagen had found a way to rig actually the diesel branded cars that they had at that time to pass emission tests initially, and then later on, after the customer took delivery, the little software that made those emissions pass the test essentially turned off, and the cars began emitting emissions that were much higher, in some cases 30 times higher than what were allowed by emission standards, particularly here in the United States. I tended to look more at the scandal as it affected the U.S., but as you mentioned, this is a worldwide scandal. It was just, you mentioned the news that broke just the other day that Volkswagen has yet another large, I think their total now is something like $30 billion in fines and paybacks and things like that. And I believe this one was for owners in Germany more recently, but certainly the settlement in the United States accounted for a huge portion of that $30 billion a couple of years ago. But the crisis continues to evolve over time. And I was quite particularly interested in how Volkswagen chose to respond to the crisis.
Who uncovered the crisis in the first place?
That's a great question, and actually, you would think it would be from one of the governments that were sort of in charge of this kind of regulation. But actually, I would highly recommend the Netflix documentary that's out. You can just search Netflix Volkswagen for that documentary, because as they describe in the documentary, this was actually discovered by a group of graduate students, engineering graduate students at University of West Virginia, and they began looking at just some of the numbers weren't matching. They were looking at various brands of cars and how they were emitting or their emissions on highway testing and road testing, and something wasn't matching up. And so just through equipment that they had in sort of their back office shop, they were able to discover that in fact there was something going on that was later validated by Environmental Protection Agency folks in the U.S. And so, interesting story about how it was discovered. It was on the private side, really, not through public agencies.
What kind of job do you think VW did in responding to the crisis?
Yeah, great question, because that's what I did my research on, right? And oftentimes in crisis, we think about, response strategy being so important, right? We want organizations to be transparent. We want them to have corrective action that is meaningful from this. And remember that stakeholders here were really harmed. I mean, these were not inexpensive vehicles. These were, $28,000, $30,000 vehicles that essentially, if you bought one brand new, became worthless because it did not meet emission standards. And so, and a lot of people bought them under the premise that Volkswagen had sort of advertised. They actually used the tagline "clean diesel," ironically, for these cars, when in the background they in fact were cheating to make them dirtier cars, essentially. And so people felt really damaged and very much harmed by this crisis. And so, understandably so, because these were, it's a higher end automobile, but it was just, typical American consumers and worldwide that were purchasing Volkswagen. Again, it had an excellent brand reputation. But the company chose to respond in a couple of ways. Initially, they were fairly quick to say, something's going on here. We need to investigate. The kind of the typical bear with us as we investigate, which is sort of a standard response from a lot of corporations when you have this kind of situation. But the restitution that they decided to offer to owners initially was very interesting. They called this their goodwill package, sort of a hang on with us as we're investigating to find out what happened. So they offered owners basically what amounted to a gift card, or actually a pair of gift cards. One was $500 that you could use anywhere, and the other one was $500 in value that you could use at a Volkswagen dealer, which again was sort of an interesting strategy because people were already upset with their Volkswagen dealers. But so you had these two gift cards that were sort of your initial restitution from the company in hopes that you would sort of bear with them as they investigated. But as you can imagine, that fell very flat and very tone deaf to owners. I did a very exhaustive search as part of my research just through tweets and online postings and things like that. And you had a lot of comments around, oh my gosh, my vehicle is worthless, and these folks are telling me to go have a nice dinner. That's just not gonna make up for it. And so the initial response was seen as sort of very substandard and not really appropriate at all. If we're going to take corrective action, typically as crisis counselors, we tell organizations it needs to be substantial, right? It needs to really have the kind of heft that will tell consumers and stakeholders that you mean business. So the gift card thing sort of fell flat. And then about a year or so later, finally they developed a compensation corrective action package that was much more substantial at that point. They were basically offering owners that they would buy back the vehicles at essentially what would be sort of blue book value, so that was the first option. And then there was also, I believe, a restitution payment on top of the buyback. And then the other option that you had was to essentially keep your vehicle and wait for a fix, which I might add they're still waiting for because Volkswagen has not developed a fix for these automobiles. And so I've read stats, something like 85-90% of consumers went for the buyback response option. But it's interesting these days, a lot of these vehicles, again, there's been no fix. And so I've seen aerial photographs of large like stadiums that have been shut. Like I believe it's the old domed stadium in Detroit has obviously lots of stadium parking, and there's cars all around. Of course, the stadium's been shut down for years, and these cars are actually Volkswagen diesels that are just sitting waiting for whatever eventually will happen to them. So two responses. What my research found was the first one, not very effective at all, the gift card thing. The second one, consumers reacted to obviously much more favorably, although many of them were saying, gee, it took a long time. The other problem Volkswagen had, frankly, with that second compensation offer to do basically the buyback was that some of their execution was slow. For instance, websites were an issue, getting somebody on the phone to make sure that your paperwork was in order so that you could get your buyback. So they actually had problems even with that ultimate secondary response as well. I think we always learn something when we look at how organizations respond to a crisis, and certainly a lot to learn in the case of Volkswagen, no question about it.
Why do you think it took so long for the company to do the right things and to do things right?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think there's been a lot of good research into kind of cultural aspects at Volkswagen. In fact, I think that's probably an area of study next for people that want to look at this case study, because as we've said, it continues to go on, right? Fines and damages and lawsuits even to this day. But I suspect that some of this was cultural. Whenever we see a large company get into big trouble, think back to like the Enron crisis. We've all seen that movie. There's cultural issues at play there, whether that be greed, whether that be a drive to succeed at all costs. Obviously corporations are very driven by the dollar, to make money for stakeholders or shareholders, and to be able to show that return. And so I think that cultural aspects come into play in all these organizations. I think at Volkswagen, what we've seen was, and a lot of the media had this from some of the engineers that worked to develop this sort of cheap fix software, was that there was a huge drive to win at all cost and to really make the diesel vehicle be a success at a consumer level. There had been attempts at that earlier. at making passenger cars that were diesel driven. And of course, one of the reasons they weren't successful was because of the perception that diesel was in fact dirtier than normal gasoline burning engines. So I think much of this had to do with culture. And sort of this drive to succeed at all costs. And so, then when you're caught, much as we saw in the Enron case, it becomes sort of this house of cards that everything is built on that comes crashing down. And so, oftentimes we see responses be substandard in that kind of situation. I will say that I think I do, and certainly ultimately the right thing to do was to buy back the cars. And that is what the company did. But, again, if you're sitting on an automobile as potentially an investment, or at least, something that you feel like is going to hold value, and then you learn that it's really not worth really anything because of the way that it pollutes, that was a real problem for consumers.
Matt, what are the major takeaways and lessons to keep in mind from VW's crisis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it's really, the main thing I would say is that we have to keep stakeholders in mind at every step along the value chain. And I think that's true when we're developing new products, if you're more of an entrepreneur. I think that's true as we're up and running in manufacturing, and then when we make changes to product. I think we always have to, obviously operate from an ethical underpinning, and that's why, I'm a big fan of well-executed corporate values programs. I think that those can go a long way. Now, there's debate out there about how well companies, actually execute their values programs. But I think when a company has taken some time and effort to really develop a core set of values and then live by those, I think that, you typically see those companies, you don't see them in trouble as much with this kind of thing. So, I think that operating from a place of ethical underpinning is probably, the most important. And then when we do make a mistake, then I think it's all about transparency, and it's all about executing well with corrective action. I think that apology and corrective action, certainly when we've harmed our stakeholders, is absolutely the best response strategy. Not always easy to execute, but I think, today's, as I always tell my students, today's consumers are much more demanding than they were maybe in the 80s and 90s. They're much more empowered through things like social media and the ability to mobilize quickly. And I think we need to remember that as organizations, that they can mobilize quickly, and so we better be ready to respond in the right way if we're wrong.
VW has dug itself into a pretty deep hole, and it seems to have a lot of challenges trying to get out of that hole. Do you think it's possible for this company or any other company to recover from a crisis such as this?
Yeah, I do think that they can recover. I think that what's interesting is many times we'll look at, and I think this is sort of a shallow indicator, but a lot of times people will look at stock price and they'll say, well, let's look at this company. They had this big crisis. Has their stock, what's happened to their stock price? But consumers sort of have short memories in many ways if they favor a particular brand. And for Volkswagen, their stock price really did recover, so I think you have to be careful there. Now, you did mention their brand rankings that hasn't recovered nearly as quickly. They have not reached the level that they were in some of the more popular brand reputation trackers out there, and this has now been obviously a few years post-crisis. So their reputational hit continues. And of course, you've got all these drivers, these former owners out there that certainly are very vocal about what happened to them. So, but they've tried to take some steps to, develop work in development. I'm not a huge expert in this, but to do some development work around economically friendly cars or environmentally friendly cars and electric vehicles and things like that. And so, I think to sort of put their emphasis more in that area probably makes a lot of sense after a crisis like this. But yeah, it's been interesting to see. I think in the early, I remember when I was certainly learning about crisis communications as a college student decades ago. They always said, well, if a company has a really stellar, really excellent reputation, then they should be able to weather a crisis better. They should be able to recover more quickly. Interestingly, is I look a lot at the reputation rankings. In fact, I do this kind of every year. And I'm noticing it's taking companies a lot longer to recover their reputation after a crisis than it did years ago. And I don't know, I suspect part of what's behind that is that the customers are more demanding and they're less forgiving, maybe than they were in the early days when we were looking at reputation rankings. And so I'm not sure that's an axiom that holds true as much now as it used to. Still, I think it's helpful to have a great reputation if you happen to weather a crisis down the road. But I think you can't bank on that, right? You can't bank on that being kind of the panacea in crisis. So I encourage organizations to continue to do the right thing, continue to be based on a good value system, live those values internally, externally, and otherwise. And I think that's probably your best insurance against a crisis long term.
What can you tell us about your work at the university?
My work currently now is an administrator at a university in the Midwest, University of Kansas, but also I teach crisis communications both to working professionals in my metro area, but also in a program that we call Masters of Homeland Security. It's another master's degree program that we actually teach in the Kansas City metropolitan area. We teach it to students in the United States Army that are going to be retiring from the Army at Fort Leavenworth. It's actually a terrific program. So they're going to be going to work in homeland security, defense kinds of jobs post-retirement. And so this particular degree program serves them as well. So I teach crisis communications in a couple of different places. One of my favorite subjects. It's a great one to teach because, as I tell my students, we just open up the newspaper and that lets us know what we'll be talking about this week because you're obviously never at a loss for material, as I know you well know.
How can people reach you, Matt?
Oh, that's nice of you. Thanks. Yeah, a couple of places. I'm on Twitter at Matt, lowercase MATT _Tidwell, at Matt _Tidwell, all lowercase. And that's probably the easiest place to reach me. Also do a bit of still some crisis communications consulting. I'm at Matt Tidwell Comms, Matt Tidwell Comms, COMMS.com. So you can reach me there as well.
My guest today has been Matt Tidwell, Assistant Dean for Graduate and Professional Studies at the University of Kansas. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Crisis Ahead podcast. Remember, it's not a matter of if companies and organizations will have a crisis, but when.